Joining us now is Carne Ross. He is the founder of Independent Diplomat, a global advisory firm that advises democratic movements and emerging democracies across the world. He's also a former British diplomat and person who writes and thinks deeply about how the world should organize itself in the 21st century. Carne, thank you for joining us. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you on. So you have a recent piece in Al Jazeera America called I Want a Referendum Too, an Independence Vote Too, How Scotland's Vote Revealed the Need for a Deeper Revolution. Explain what you're arguing, the kind of main takeaways from this piece, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Well, it starts from an analysis of what people actually wanted in Scotland when they were thinking about independence. And it was pretty clear that what it wasn't was old-school nationalism of a kind of atavistic kind that, Scots as a race should run Scotland. It was much more about a desire to bring decision-making back to them, a feeling that they had lost control over their own affairs. And my claim is that feeling, I think, is pretty universal. It's not just felt in Scotland, it's felt everywhere, and indeed it's felt here in the US, that people feel that government isn't solving the problems that they most care about, and that they would like more control. And so, I then argue that one way of doing that is a kind of form of radical devolution, which is actually, could also be described more provocatively as a kind of gentle anarchism, which is models of self-government and economic self-organization, such as we've seen in Brazil, for instance, where whole cities have managed themselves through popular debate and decision-making involving many thousands of citizens. And I suggest this might be something that we should consider more globally.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get back to the Brazil examples, and these examples are very exciting. But let's go into more first the sort of the failures and what people are sort of responding to, and the distinctions in nationalisms. I think this is really, really important point, and we saw this in Scotland, that the reaction, as you say, was not a sort of narrow, we want we want a Scottish state for Scottish people. It was, we want to preserve a certain way of governance. We want more accountability. We want more power from the bottom up. You link this, Europe, the United States, there is this kind of global phenomenon. But taking specifically, you went to the French example, which I think is important because you're showing how basically, France elected a socialist president in 2012. The campaign was about reversing austerity within France, and also a broader argument about the Eurozone, which is really hollowing itself out through austerity. The presidency of Hollande has been a failure by a number of metrics. And in France, you're seeing the opening through this failure, not for the sort of progressive 21st century nationalism you're talking about, but a resurgence of a very old school, very dangerous brand of nationalism. I'd like you to talk about those failures and talk about the sort of dark side of nationalism rising up again as well.
Well, you put it very well, Michael. What I think has happened in France is that basically you've had a failure of a classic liberal democracy, a centralized government attempting to manage the economic forces of globalization, such as investment, interest rates, in a way that benefits the people who voted for the government, ordinary French people. And they failed to do that. Unemployment has stayed high. The government attempted to maintain and strengthen controls on wage levels, employment protection, state industries, so sort of classical progressive, if not socialist, ways of managing the economy in a more fair and equitable manner. So it's not just benefiting the rich, but ordinary workers and people are also enjoying the benefits. And that failed partly because markets and the investors very, very quickly, as soon as these policies were announced, said, this isn't going to work. We're pulling our money out. And this had an immediate effect on French bonds. So the cost of French borrowing rapidly escalated. This literally took about a day And there was enormous political pressure on the Hollande government, which eventually rescinded these proposals. So you saw, in a way, how the forces of global capital undermined a democratically elected government to do what it wanted. And I think those forces, that consequence, that situation, has had a profound political effect in France, which is a disillusionment with the typical statist French model, and instead turning to a very nasty, frankly racist, anti-immigration reaction, a very reactionary force in the form of the French National Front, who've shot ahead in the opinion polls. So what you've seen is this kind of crisis of democracy, of the typical model of democracy caused by the forces of globalization, has actually opened the door for the far right. And I think those of us who worry about such things, worry about the far right, need to take this very, very seriously and think about a response other than just more of the same old politics. And yes, we can tinker with centralized policy to fix these problems, because I don't think we can. No government in the West is adequately addressing rising inequality, for instance. And, what is the answer to that actually meaningfully alters that? The far right, in fact, don't offer answers to that except stopping immigration, which actually won't fix that problem. So their promises are completely hollow, but unfortunately they are also very, very divisive political force, and I think we have to stop them.
Absolutely, and I think the other important point that you're really getting to here, and that example illustrates, is that and I think, and people who critiqued the sort of one-dimensional globalization that's been implemented over the past couple of decades with this very kind of narrow focus on liberalizing certain sectors and capital flows, and not with raising standards, and not with democratic accountability, and not with a countervailing force of local accountability either. People said, that from the beginning, who were critics of this model, and now I think we're seeing it much more kind of broadly felt, is that the old story that it's just government that has unaccountable bureaucracies that don't respond to people's real conditions and lives, that may be true in certain circumstances, but corporate bureaucracy is certainly just as big a threat to the democratic impulse and to people flourishing as government bureaucracy, if not more in today's context.
Yeah, and I think that works in several different ways. I think, certainly the economic advantage has gone, as it always has, to monopolistic companies that dominate global business, in particular commodities and services. Banking is a classic example, which is dominated, by a very few massive corporate entities. I can't imagine it's that much fun to work for these places. I imagine that the ordinary employee feels absolutely no agency whatsoever over their futures, which is why I prefer a cooperative model of common ownership by workers and also customers potentially, where they decide how their entity, how their corporate entity, how their cooperative is governed, so that, again, the benefits of agency, shared power, and shared economic benefits are accrued to everybody in the company, and that is a viable model. It could happen. There are cooperative banks that work, credit unions around the world, and in fact they could be more competitive than the commercial banks because they don't have to offer shareholders big profits every quarter. So I think that's one problem with the nature of the corporation, the company today. Another is, of course, that these corporations buy influence in democratic governments, supposedly democratic governments. Again, banks are a really good example of this. They are essentially writing banking legislation in Washington. They have enormous influence in all capitals because governments don't want to annoy and seem hostile to what at first sight seems a positive force, which is the free movement of capital, banks that are flexible, profit-making, successful. It sounds like something that should benefit all of us. In fact, it's not. It's benefiting a very few. But unfortunately, these corporations are also capturing our governments and writing legislation that is for their benefit, not for ours.
Well, the one problem I see in what you're saying is that there's no room for Jamie Dimon, and he is a genius. I'm just kidding, Carn. So always have to have some Jamie Dimon material on this show. It feels like,
Yeah,
so
I'm happy to talk about Jamie Dimon. Yeah, I saw that Chase
yeah.
Manhattan, J.P. Morgan was again paying a massive fine this week, as they often do.
Right.
Barely a week passes without J.P. Morgan being found guilty of some offence, criminal or civil. This one was, I think, about manipulating interest rates, LIBOR.
Yes.
I think this was about
the
LIBOR.
LIBOR
There's
case,
an extraordinary scandal where basically a few banks have ripped off everybody, literally everybody, in a way that is completely unaccountable, and they're paying some meager fine that will barely hit their share prices.
Right. Well, I mean, so in a in a certain sense, there is some sort of genius completely unanchored by any ethical, legal, or any other type of tradition of accountability. But let's go into these alternatives. That's another sort of very exciting thing that you're writing about and talking about. You mentioned Brazil. You mentioned cooperative banking. Give some examples of where this other way of organizing ourselves and governing and engaging in business is in action right now and pointing the way to a different future.
Well, I think the watchword is putting people back in control. That's what folks seem to want around the world, and it's a very natural instinct. People want to have control over their own political and economic affairs, and that can be done. And if you're doing that, then you're doing generally the right thing. And in government, that means mass participation in decision making. Mm-hmm. And that has been very successful in a city called Porto Alegre in Brazil, where over 10 years, 50,000 people a year were taking part in debates about how the city budget was spent. And a World Bank study at the end of those 10 years found that this has had extraordinary benefits in terms of producing better services for the poorer as well as the richer areas. Porto Alegre was a sort of classic Latin American city, a very rich center, but suburbs of very poor favelas. And it transformed Porto Alegre. There was a fourfold increase in the number of schools. Health and sanitation services were much more equitably distributed, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, this is returning to a traditional, if you like, model of democracy, as they had in Athens, where ordinary citizens were the ones who took the decisions. In Athens, they took it in turns, just as they do have done in Porto Alegre. So it's actually returning us to a much more traditional, orthodox sense of what democracy really is. It's government by the people so that it's for the people. Likewise, in the workplace, again, the watchword is giving control back to workers. I don't think it means everybody gets paid the same. I think, it's inevitable that you're going to have some differential according to skill levels and abilities, but that differential could be radically reduced from the grotesque discrepancies that we've got today, where CEOs are paid 300 times what their average worker is paid. And that differential can be reduced. It has been done in cooperatives, for instance, in Spain, where a large cooperative called Mondragon is Spain's fifth largest company. So this is a plausible business model. This is not utopian. And what it produces is benefits which, not only are these companies profitable and competitive, but they produce all kinds of social benefits which we lack today, such as a sense of empowerment for workers and real equality that derives not from redistributive taxation, but from actually people sharing the benefits of their labor.
Right. Before you even get to the redistribution, you're sort of building it into the baseline in a different way. I mean,
exactly.
As a final question, how do you see the relationship between and actually in some ways that's an important question right there, because obviously in a relative sense, it is quite important to push for a more progressive tax code as an example, because that's a means right now through which you can address this grotesque and out of control crisis and inequality that you pointed to. At the same time, you're pointing to these models that really could alter the balance and as we said, the baseline of how these things operate to begin with. How do you see the relationship, I guess, between working to reform and fight within the constraints of the current arrangement, the current way of doing things in governance and in business, versus putting energy on sort of shaping just really a different model of doing things? What's the relationship between those two impulses?
I think it's difficult to make a universal conclusion to that question. I think it differs in different circumstances. I think people need to start talking about it, and they need to start demanding it of their politicians and of their companies where they work. That is, it's not implausible that governments and companies could start to encourage this kind of trend themselves. But myself, I don't believe that any government or any corporation run by a wealthy few for their own benefit is going to institute that kind of change sufficiently. So I think that instead we do need to be thinking about building up new structures ourselves, from our local neighborhood, where we might form a group to talk about the needs of the local neighborhood, or a group talking about the future of their local hospital. Politicians are going to have to attend to these kinds of formations if they are to be legitimate and if they are to get their own decisions implemented. Likewise, I see no alternative but to found new forms of cooperatives, the cooperative companies. That is doable. Also, as a consumer, you can choose the better option. You can choose to put your money in a credit union rather than Chase. You can choose to shop at places where workers are treated properly, environmental standards are high. In New York State, for instance, where I live, the state has allowed, astonishingly, this was not allowed before, but they have allowed things called B Corps, which are benefit corporations, which measure their bottom line both by environmental and social impact for their workers, as well as by profit. Before, any company in New York State that was privately run, any private profit-seeking company, had to purely seek profit. I mean, is it any wonder that we had a screwed-up economy like we've had?
Absolutely. Well, Carne Ross, he is the founder of Independent Diplomat, writer, and really someone who thinks very perceptively about the biggest challenges and opportunities of our time. I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the discussion, Michael. I appreciate it.